Well, thank you, Wes, for reading that. Yeah, it was like, who do I get to read a 57 verse, or who should I not? And some people are like, anytime, Christopher, you just stay away from me when it comes to those. I get it. No, especially when it has names in it, right? Well, no, we started this year spending 2025 going all the way through, I'm going to move this back a little bit, going all the way through the Torah, right? The first 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And this week we reach the end of our thematic look at Genesis before we move on to Exodus next week. And just as a reminder, if you have questions after I finish Exodus, we're going to do a time of question and response, and just to be able to answer things that maybe we didn't cover, or you're like, oh, I wasn't sure about that. Send them my way. Text me, call me, email me, ask me in person, whatever. If you have some things you'd love to have answered in this book or in the next, I'd love to do that. So just a reminder. But if you get to know me over time, you'll discover my love for a few things. I love to run, right? I loved it a little bit less at mile 23 last week, but I do love it. I love West Virginia football. It's probably one of my favorite things to watch. I'm a huge fan of zombie movies, and one of my favorite artists has got to be John Mayer. Now, I love him not only for his guitar skills, but also I love his lyrics. And it's funny, sometimes when you see art that mimics life. John Mayer wrote a song a few years back called In the Blood. And it's a song about whether or not life is determined by traits that are passed down to us from our family, or if we have some kind of control over our circumstances. You know, as I think about the lyrics of this song, I can't help but think of the character in Genesis that we're covering today. His name is Joseph, or in Hebrew is Yosef, which means he shall increase, or God shall increase. And you'll see his name comes to fruition. You know, Joseph comes from a family God has chosen to be a conduit of blessing to the entire world. Remember Genesis 12, which sounds like it would be a wonderful family to come from, right? You'd think that'd be a great lineage to come from. However, if you've read the story of the patriarchs of Genesis, you kind of know that this family does not always look the part, right? They are a family that would easily give the Kardashians and their dysfunction, I think, a run for their money. Honestly, if it was a TV show, I'm surprised you've never seen one, it would be an E ratings gold. I think it would. Think about it. Joseph's great-grandfather, he followed Yahweh closely at times, right? But he was often a man that put the women in his life at great danger. His grandfather trusted Yahweh that he would provide a substitute for him when he was carrying the wood up the hill, right? Yet, his grandfather also tried to directly disobey Yahweh by blessing his favorite son instead of the one that God told him to. Well, Joseph's daddy, he was the chief deceiver probably in Jesus' entire lineage. His name literally means heel grabber, or later it's changed to fights with God, right? And if you know the story in Genesis 49, in his very dying breaths, he's even at that moment trying to grasp for making Joseph's sons his own instead of giving Joseph his own lineage. He tries to grasp it. If you know his mother also, Joseph's mother was quite the deceiver and schemer too, which she learned from her daddy, Laban. Heck, I think if you look at his family, a couple of his brothers are murderers, Simeon and Levi. One has sex with his stepmother. Yep. While another sleeps with his daughter-in-law because he thinks she's a prostitute. I mean, really, like you're going, this is his family. And these same brothers, they even sell Joseph into slavery, and they deceive their father into thinking he's dead by putting blood of an animal on his robe and giving it to their dad. And the list just goes on and on and on with his family. So I think the question for this young man, Joseph, as we read his story, is like the John Mayer song says. And I put these up here for you. I love this. Think about how much of my mother has my mother left in me? How much of my love will be insane to some degree? And what about this feeling that I'm never good enough? Will it wash out in the water, or is it always in the blood? How much of my father am I destined to become? Will I dim the lights inside me just to satisfy someone? Will I let this woman kill me or do away with jealous love? Will it wash out in the water? Will it always in the blood? How much like my brothers do my brothers want to be? Does a broken home become another broken family? Or will we be there for each other like nobody ever could? Will it wash out in the water? Is it always in the blood? He says, I can feel the love I want, I can feel the love I need, but it's never going to come the way that I am. Could I change it if I wanted? Could I rise above the flood? Will it wash out in the water? Is it always in the blood? I love when art imitates life. Will Joseph be like his family? A people characterized by grasping for blessing. Or will he rise above all that and wait for Yahweh to be the one who brings blessing in his timing? You know, much of Genesis scroll consists of these meditations and stories about over and over of children replaying and even at times intensifying their parents' failures. And I think it's especially true of the first set of parents, Adam and Eve, right? Every generation has stories in which people not only replay Adam and Eve's failure, but also pattern the actual vocabulary in the stories at the failure at the tree. And I think Genesis makes a great statement about human condition. That as much as every generation wants to think that, right, we're different from our parents, we're awfully just simply a more elaborate and developed variation of the same struggle that our parents had, right? I'm going to be so much better than my parents, and how often do we play the same role? You know, Joseph's story, I think, is a perfect ending to the book of Genesis because he stands in contrast to those who comes before him. And I think what we get is we get a glimpse of a life that waits what late and poor in God looks like. Joseph's life shows a character who both takes the curses of others upon himself and he turns them into blessings. And also through his suffering, he becomes a source of life to others. So I think we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to do a lot of skipping, but I want to jump into his story now to finish out Genesis. So we're going to start in chapters 37 with the very beginning of Joseph's story. Look at 37, verse 2. It says, this is the account of Jacob. So this is the account of Jacob. And what do we see the very first thing? Joseph, his 17-year-old son, was taking care of the flocks with his brothers. And now he was a youngster working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Those were his stepmothers, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Well, from the very beginning, we meet this man Joseph, right, as a young teenager, right? He's a young man. He has 10 older brothers. And the first thing you learn about Joseph is that he brings a bad report of his brothers back to his father. It's kind of an interesting place to start, isn't it? It shows you something about the brothers that he's hanging out with. But before we get there, let's discuss Joseph's relationship with his father. Look at verses 3 and 4. You want to see some more dysfunction. Now Israel, also Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was son born to him late in life. And he made him a special tunic for him. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated Joseph and were not able to speak to him kindly. Right? The one known as fights with God, Israel, loved Joseph more than his other sons. Well, who else kind of has who else has this idea of that they maybe love their one son more than others? Well, what Isaac was to Abraham, right? He was his son of his old age. Jacob is to Joseph, son of his old age. And Jacob even gives Joseph this special robe, this special tunic, right? To show everybody that this is my favorite son. Who else loved one son more than the other? Well, his parents, remember? Remember, Isaac loved who more? Esau. And Rebekah, his mother, loved Jacob more. If there's anyone that should understand what sibling rivalry comes from loving one son over the other, it should be Jacob. And yet, what does he do? Repeats the same sins of his parents because he doesn't learn. And so in the story, it goes on. Next, Joseph tells his brothers a dream, or actually two, in fact. One of them involves his brothers. They see these bundles of grain, and Joseph sees that he has a bundle of grain, and there are 10 bundles of grain. They all bow down to his one. He's like, I don't know what that means, right? And then there's this other dream, a second one. It's about the sun and the moon and the 10 stars. They all come and they bow down to Joseph. He goes, I don't know what that means either, right? You're going, really? Now, of course, what do his brothers think about this? Do you think any of them like him telling this, the dreamer, as they call him? No, they do not. They hate Joseph for it, and they scheme up a plan to kill him, right? And they wait, brothers who wait until their favorite brother comes out in the field and they're going to kill him. Does that sound familiar? Sounds a little bit like Cain and Abel, right? But what they do is while they scheme, what do? They say, here comes a dreamer, and they strip him of his robe and they throw him in a pit, down into a pit below the ground. What else do you throw in the ground? Bodies, death. It's the pit. It's kind of like they say to him, you think you're meant to rule and be a ruler of the sky? Well, now you're a dweller of the pit. He goes from the heavens all the way to the grave in short time. From one end of the cosmos to the other, so to speak. But look at this in verse 27, or 25 through 27. They want to first kill him, but Reuben actually goes, well, let's just keep him in a pit. Let's think about it for a little bit. Gets them all to eat, get the hangriness out of the way. And in verse 25, it says, when they sat down to eat their food, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Those were descendants. Those were their great-grand uncle, or their granduncle there. And their camels were carrying spices, balm, and myrrh down to eat down to Egypt. Look at that. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not lay a hand on him. For after all, he is our brother, I guess, right, of our flesh. So when the Midianites merchants passed by, Joseph's brother pulled him out of the cistern, sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, not even how much a slave would be worth. And the Ishmaelites then took Joseph down to Egypt. So what Judah decides, the fourth born, decides to sell Joseph into slavery instead of killing him. So in short time, we see Joseph go from the favored position to being stripped of his robes, descending into the pit, and now becoming a slave and descending all the way down into Egypt. Notice if you read this narrative, how many times Joseph is going down, down, down. And this idea, this descent, is kind of an essential theme in these stories for Joseph. See, Joseph's descent into the pit and his descent into Egypt as a slave are all images of his exile. Exile from his family, from his royal status, from his father's love, and from the promised land. And you probably know what it feels like, right? To be excluded, to be set aside, or banished from your relationships. You think about it, exile is a bit of death, is it not? I think these stories explore exile in one of its most extreme forms. And we're going to skip a little ahead. The next stage of Joseph's going down appears just 2 chapters later. Look in chapter 39. But before he goes down again, there is this slight little uptick in Joseph's life. He's briefly elevated. Why? Because he's faithful in waiting upon Yahweh. Look at chapter 39, verses 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, purchased him from the Ishmaelites who had bought him there. Yahweh was with Joseph. He was successful and lived in the household of his Egyptian master. And his master observed that Yahweh was with him and that Yahweh made everything he was doing successful. And so Joseph found favor in the sight and became his personal attendant. And Potiphar appointed Joseph overseer of his household and put him in charge of everything he owned. And from that time, Potiphar appointed him over the household and over all that he owned. And Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's household for Joseph's sake. The blessing of Yahweh, the barakah, was upon everything that he had, both in his house and in his fields. And so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. He gave no thought to anything except for the food that he ate. Right? Joseph is the epitome of what? Blessing. Genesis 12, right? God blesses Joseph as he said he would, and Joseph is what? A blessing to those around him. Maybe things were looking up, right? Maybe things are on the upward swing, but it doesn't last long. If you know the story, Potiphar's wife, she plays the garden motif once again. She sees Joseph. If you look at in verse 6, now Joseph was well-built and good-looking. If there's one thing you'd love to have said about you in the Bible that's going to be immortalized, that'd be pretty good. But he's well-built and good-looking. And what is Potiphar's wife? She looks at Joseph, she desires him, and she what? Tries to take the fruits for herself. To grasp the fruit. But Joseph is having none of it, will he? Look at verse 9. Whenever he's confronted about this, he said, there is none greater in this household than I am. He, being Potiphar, has withheld nothing from me except for you because you were his wife. I love this. So how could I do such a great evil and sin against who? My God. And what does Joseph do? He pays for his being righteous. For the second time, Joseph is cast down into a pit. But this time he's thrown into prison for no good reason, with his cloak yet again being the only thing used as evidence, right? Twice now this has happened to Joseph. He's done nothing wrong, but he is sent into an even deeper pit, into a prison. And Joseph appears to be forgotten yet again. But what does he do? He patiently waits on Yahweh for his redemption. If you jump in the following chapter 40, there's a story of two men employed by Pharaoh who were imprisoned with Joseph, and each has a dream that they can't interpret. Note, two dreams again. Joseph had two dreams. There's two men that have two dreams. One, he's going to have his head cut off. The other is going to have his head elevated and restored to his position. And God enables Joseph to interpret both dreams. And the cupbearer promised to him, I promise when I get out of here, I'm totally going to remember you, Joseph. But what does chapter 40, verse 23 say? But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. 2 more years down in the pit, huh, God? You got to imagine Joseph is like, yet again, here I am. I don't know why. Why am I down in this pit? However, when we see, as the reader, we think maybe there's no hope for Joseph, right? Chapter 41 comes along. Look at chapter 41, verses 1 through 5. This is what Wes read earlier. I won't do the whole thing. Don't worry. At the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh had a dream. As he was standing by the Nile, 7 fine-looking fat cows were coming up out of the Nile. They grazed in the reeds. Then 7 bad-looking thin cows were coming up after them in the Nile. And they stood beside the other cows at the edge of the river. The bad-looking thin cows ate the 7 fine-looking fat cows. And Pharaoh woke up. But then he fell asleep again and had a second dream. And basically, his second dream comes, and it's the same kind of thing, but it's about grain instead of cows, right? Notice, how many dreams does Pharaoh have? 2. 2 more dreams. But what's the problem with Pharaoh? No one can what? No one can interpret. No one can help Pharaoh, right? But it's at this moment, 2 years later, oh yeah. By the way, I know a guy, right? I know a guy that can help you with this, Pharaoh. He remembers Joseph. But who hadn't forgotten Joseph? God had not forgotten Joseph. And he does not forget us when we are down in the pit. And this man tells Pharaoh what Joseph was able to do for him. And so Pharaoh sends for Joseph, right? They hurriedly brought him out of the pit. They cleaned him up, right? Get him out of this pit for a couple years. And what does Joseph do? He interprets the 2 dreams for Pharaoh. And he tells him there's going to be 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And that he should prepare an abundance for the years of want. And what is Joseph able to do for all of Egypt? And not only Egypt, but for the nations surrounding Egypt. He saves them. He blesses them. He brings them a salvation that they might not have had otherwise. And I love what Genesis 41, 37 through 40 says. This is what Pharaoh says. Look at 41 verses 37 through 40, This advice made sense to Pharaoh and all of his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, It's a rhetorical. Can we find a man like Joseph, one in whom the what? The Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, is present. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, because God has enabled you to know all of this, there is no one as wise and discerning as you are. Maybe knowing good and evil, right? You will oversee my household, and all my people will submit to your commands. Only I, the king, will be greater than you. Pharaoh and his servants regard Joseph as a man whom the Ruach Elohim, God's Spirit, dwells. And you realize when you're reading through Genesis, when was the last time we saw this? Anything about the Ruach, if you remember the early. This is before Abraham. It's early Genesis. It's the first time where God's Spirit's mentioned. And the Spirit dwells within a human who dreams of being seated in the heavens to rule over the earth. And in Joseph, you see the fingerprints of Genesis 1 and 2. They're evident through him. And I love this story. I love with Joseph because he acts contrary to Adam and Eve, right? Rather than waiting for wisdom from God, Adam and Eve what? Sought to grasp it for themselves. But Joseph possesses the spirit of wisdom, which guides all of his actions, and he patiently waits on God. And I love Pharaoh appoints Joseph as his second command. Thus, in a sense, Joseph becomes a what of Pharaoh? He puts him as ruler over all of his things. What does he become? An image of Pharaoh. He becomes an image bearer, and he looks like Pharaoh to rule in his stead. Even as he is bearing God's image in the way that God intended him to. And I think Joseph's story brings all together, all the themes of Genesis in such like a beautiful symphony, right? What Genesis begins with the idea that all humans are in the image of God himself. But in the end here, we see a human ruling in the way that honors God and rules in the wisdom that he provides. God lifted Adam and Eve up to rule the earth, and what did they choose to do? To descend into exile. But while Joseph started in an exalted position and then descended into exile, what does he do? He returns to a position where he ruled over others because of his faithfulness to Yahweh. And it's in this exalted position he's given what in verse 42? Look at this. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his own hand, put it on Joseph's. There's an image. And he clothed him with what? Fine linen clothes, and put a gold chain around his neck. What is Joseph restored to for a third time? Another cloak, another garment to show that there's something about this man. It's a restoration of what he's lost. Time and again, God responds to the wrongs done to Joseph by weaving a narrative of exile into one of exaltation. And Joseph's story kind of becomes a pattern replayed in the story, I think, of the suffering servant, the Messiah. His rule involves him descending into death on behalf of others so that he can be exalted and become the source of life to others. Also see Isaiah 52 and 53. If you want to read something this week, look at the beauty of the Messiah who follows in a better way even than Joseph. To the pit, but to exaltation. And so from Genesis 42 on to all the way to the end of the book, what the narrator, he's going to do after this, he's going to kind of switch back and forth between Joseph and his brothers that are in Canaan. And it's kind of this one long testing narrative. Joseph is going to put all these clever little schemes together to create scenarios to recreate what his brothers did to him back in chapters 37. But they don't know that it's Joseph doing it the whole time. They don't know it's him. And what's he going to do along the way? He's going to accuse them of being spies. And he's going to take one of their brothers, Simeon, and lock him away. And then he sends them back with food, but puts money in their sacks. So they go back to their dad with all of this extra money and food with one brother left behind. Right? What are they going to do? He says, go back home. They're loaded with cash and home with food and money, but they must abandon a brother along the way. What will they do? Well, when they go back, they could just say, well, an animal got him, Dad, right? It worked once. It could work again, maybe. But what do? They tell the truth to their father when they get back. And then we find out later in the story that there's a new favorite son, because Jacob thought Joseph's dead for 20 years. So he's got a new favorite son. Anybody know who it is? It's Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, the other son of his favorite wife at the time, right? Joseph's really bad at this stuff. Jacob's really bad at this stuff. And Jacob refuses to let his favorite son go anywhere. But it's really cool. At this point, in chapter 43, verse 9, the brother who suggests selling Joseph in the first place becomes the one unwilling to let his family die. Look at this in 43:9. Whenever they say, he says, no way I'm letting Benjamin go. I already lost one favored son. I'm not losing another. Judah says, he goes in 43:9, he says, I myself pledge security for him. You may hold me liable. If I do not bring him back to you and place him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. Maybe these brothers are learning something. They convince Jacob, right? They do bring Benjamin. When they arrive, the final test hits. Jacob's got one final test for them. You know what Joseph does for Benjamin? He sits them all down to get a nice meal. And you know what? He gives them all plenty of food. But what does he do for Benjamin? He gives him 5 times more and better food than he gives the other 10. Let's see how they respond this time to the favored brother. Will they be jealous once again? The favored son, and he even sends up a cup, and there's a chance to take Benjamin back to see if they'll abandon him yet again after the favored one. But not this time. I love it. Judah steps in and offers his life as a substitute for Benjamin. He says, no, take me instead of my brother. Remember that Yahweh will provide the substitute. Remember Isaac? He will provide the substitute. And I love it. And it's at this moment Joseph breaks down and he reveals himself to his brothers. And I love Joseph tells his brothers that Yahweh is the one that orchestrated this entire situation to provide for his family and bless the nation of Egypt. God used Joseph's circumstances of going down, 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 down in order to what? To bless all of those around him. In every way, Joseph is an image of God's anointed one. It's through his suffering that a remnant of God's people is preserved. And it's through his faithfulness that blessing goes out to all of the nations. And he even at the end of it does what? Forgives his brothers, for they do not know what they were doing. The ones that wanted to try to kill him. And I think what's fascinating in Genesis is that the Abrahamic blessing, it's interesting. You see it passed, it's told to Abraham, it's told to Isaac, it's told to Jacob. Yet it is never mentioned to Joseph specifically that blessing would be passed on to him. Yet he is the only one that embodies the blessing as shown by the fruit of his life. He has been blessed, and in turn, he is a blessing to the nations. I think it's the story of Genesis. It begins with the promise, right, that a seed of woman would come to crush evil in the head. And while he does, he will be struck and suffer. Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, and humanity continued, separated from God. But here, Joseph is sold into slavery, locked in prison, lost and alone. But I love it. Like chapter 50 says, what humans intended for evil, what? God worked out for good. And Joseph's exile becomes a bit of a homecoming. He's released from prison and reunited with his family. Joseph was dead, but now he is alive. And I think while this theme of exile is prominent in the final pages of Genesis, it's the end of the story is kind of like a climax. You know, in a symphony, you have all the movements that happen throughout, and at the end, they all kind of come together. You start seeing them all fill up the symphony. And all the major themes and the patterns from earlier in the book, they all come together here at the end with Joseph. As Genesis comes to a close, Jacob is on his deathbed, and he asks his sons to promise to take his bones back up to Canaan from Egypt. Look at chapter 49, verses 29 through 31. After he's given his blessing to his sons, he says, "Then he instructed them, I am about to go to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave of the field of Ephron the Hittite. It is the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought for a burial plot from Ephron the Hittite. And there they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were acquired from the sons of Heth." You remember Machpelah? In our time and looking at the trees, the cave of the naked pair, right? With the trees around, where God had met them at Mamre, where the God who sees them, they're buried there in hope, and it's described as a mini Eden. I think the whole Genesis story riffs on this idea that death is not the final event in a person's life. Rather, the final event is returning to Eden. And I believe, though it's not fully patterned out here or fully seen until later, I think we see the pattern representing of the resurrection that's seen right here in the promise that these patriarchs have. In the very last paragraph of Genesis, Joseph's story is him saying, hey, I'm going to go die here, but God made a promise to me, or to us, that he would bring us up out of the land. Whatever you do, take my bones with you when you go up. And I think it's this story in Genesis makes you consider that if death is the ultimate exile, the hope of the resurrection is the ultimate homecoming in the return to Eden. And that's where Genesis ends, is with a hope that God will restore. What a picture the story of Joseph presents. He's a man who did not grasp for knowledge of good and evil, but he patiently waited until Yahweh provided it. Why? Because Joseph trusted him. Joseph descends into the depths of darkness in prison and was uplifted to the highest position in Egypt by the mighty hand of God. He honors his father. He loves his brothers. He trusts Yahweh implicitly. He provides in famine. He accurately shares Yahweh's mind when it's revealed to him. He becomes the very curse the brothers had brought upon themselves, and their guilt did not seem to be commensurate with Joseph's suffering from their own cursing and grasping, yet he took it on himself. And so Genesis ends with a hope that the tree of life and subsequent blessings will still be had. And Jacob and Joseph are buried, what? In hope. I love Joseph's story because I think Joseph gives us a glimpse into the ultimate son of promise, the ultimate favored son, the one and only Son of God, the God-man, Jesus. And it's Jesus who fulfills the hope for which Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants at Machpelah were buried. Galatians chapter 3 tells us that Jesus became the curse for us to redeem us from the curse of the law. And that this was so that Abraham's blessing would come to those outside of the family, and that you and I could receive the promise of the Spirit by faith. And what was the promise of the Spirit, or the Ruach by faith? Early in Genesis, we saw that the Spirit is what? Life. True life. The tree of life and blessing, ultimately given to us through Christ, who also what? Trusted his Father, loved his brothers, did not grasp, is the very bread of life for the famine of our souls. He who became the curse for us, who descended into the depths and raised at the right time to be seated in the heavenlies at the right hand of God, and accurately shares the mind of Yahweh. He is indeed Yahweh fully in the flesh and nothing less than that. So as we close Genesis, I want to challenge us. Let us ask ourselves, if we are a people of God who have been given the Spirit to live among us, bringing life, wisdom, power, and presence. If we are tasked with sharing our heavenly blessings that we have in Christ Jesus to those around us who have no hope. If we have hope in the resurrection of Jesus, the restoration to the earth, of the earth to Eden, where God and humanity worship together in peace and fulfillment, will we be a people who see all of these truths and wait patiently upon our Heavenly Father for the wisdom and deliverance that He will bring in His timing, blessing others while we wait? Or will we follow in our ancestors? Will it be in the blood? In our following our ancestors' footsteps who grasped for the divine, who grasp for what our Heavenly Father already desires to give us, if we only wait for Him to provide the good and perfect gifts He possesses. What will it be? Will we wait or will we grasp? As Jesus said, whoever has ears had better listen. Let's pray.